Hi everyone, welcome to the latest in our series of lockdown video interviews. Today I'm joined by Professor Michael Winter. Now Michael's a Professor of Land Economy and Society here at Exeter and Chair of the Centre for Rural Policy Research. Now Michael's written extensively on food and agriculture and worked on numerous DEFRA projects. And his current research focuses on the governance of sustainable agriculture, food systems and food security. So thanks very much for joining me, Michael. Welcome.
Oh, nice to be here.
We hear often how much of a challenge it is to be a farmer or a fisherman at the moment in recent years in this country. What are some of the issues that they face kind of outside of the pandemic, just much more generally?
Well, I think more generally, it's a tough industry. There's been a kind of cost price squeeze for many years, farmers having to produce more to make the same kind of living. So farms tend to have become bigger. They've also had to cope with quite a lot of disease issues, particularly around bovine TB, which imposes restrictions, causes all sorts of difficulties. So it's been a tough industry to be in the last, I would say, 20 years. Heavily dependent on common agricultural policy payments, which are now about to be phased out. So that's going to impose new tough decision making for farmers, really. It's going to be a hard time, I think.
Yeah. And now with the pandemic on top of that, how is that affecting production operations?
Well, it's a very mixed story, and it's also a story that we probably don't have all the data and evidence yet. If you're dependent on labour for picking, fruit and veg, that sort of stuff, then there's clearly been some labour issues because a lot of that labour comes from overseas, and there've been travel issues. That was also becoming an issue because of Brexit anyway. So there's that side of it. What has also been apparent is the whole food system has changed because we've lost the restaurants and the cafes. So that's roughly 30% of our kind of food economy is that. And overnight that almost disappeared. Now, you might say, well, if people aren't eating in restaurants, they're eating at home, what's the issue? The issue is really to do with sort of packaging and bulk and all that sort of thing. I mean, you've probably heard, well, I'm sure most people will be aware of the difficulty in getting hold of flour. Yeah. That's not because there's not enough flour around. It's because a lot of flour has been marketed, basically sold to the catering industry in big sacks. You and I don't walk into a shop and buy flour in big sacks. It's not a particularly easy thing to deal with. So those sorts of issues. Similarly, some in milk is another interesting example. If you're a farmer who's producing milk but is going into liquid milk for doorstep delivery or retail or for cheese, then you'll probably haven't noticed much of a difference apart from a slight depression a significant depression of prices. But if you're producing for a supplier who's providing milk for the restaurant business and for making cappuccinos on the high street, then you might suddenly find your contract's been reduced or even got rid of. So there's a whole load of adjustment issues that have been around that in the last few weeks that it's difficult to see ultimately where it's going to end up. And of course, we don't know when restaurants and cafes might be opened up either. So it's a very volatile and tricky time. I have to say, I think, most farmers being farmers have just got on with stuff. I mean, I live out in the country. I've got a few acres, but I live next to an intensive dairy farm. He's been doing his usual stuff. He's had, during this period of lockdown, he's had first cut of silage on the fields next to me. He's followed that by injection of slurry going for his second cut in the kind of normal way. And so he's still presumably churning out the milk for whoever he sells to. So a lot of stuff is still going on. Yeah. And mercifully, there've been no shortage, as far as I'm aware, of any of the sort of basic supplies around diesel, and which obviously is a huge thing, the fuel and machinery and that sort of thing. So the operation is continuing, but a lot of volatility within that.
Yeah. Now you mentioned flour. I mean, obviously, at the start of the crisis, there were empty shelves in supermarkets. People were panic buying. Were the empty shelves, was that just logistics, or are there actually supply issues?
It's mainly logistics and this sort of different nature of the supply chains, different routes to market. So it's not, as far as I'm aware, a fundamental shortage of anything. I must confess I've been amazed in many ways how not that I've been myself, because I'm old. My 27-year-old son has tended to go in and do a shop every so often, a few weeks. But we've got most of what we want, and including, and I'm sure it's the case for many people, there have been a few shortages, obviously, but things like, oranges and bananas that you think might have been disrupted still seem to be coming in on the shelf. So I think the supply chain actually has proved itself to be really quite resilient. Which I think there's a lot of people around saying, "Oh, supermarkets, terrible things," and this is a jolt to the supply chain. We'll end up with much shorter supply chains, and we may or may not. But the supermarkets actually have found ways of performing quite well, as far as I can see. There may be other arguments against them or for them, but in this particular context, there have not been massive shortages. Now, I mean, I think there are other issues to do with where the crisis has led to people reduced income, losing work, trying to feed children at home who perhaps they didn't have to feed at home before. All of that has led to some real social justice issues and food justice issues as part of this crisis. It's not to do with a fundamental shortage of food. It's to do with social justice and distributional issues, really.
Yeah, I mean, obviously talking about things like bananas, that's a food import. I mean, we must import quite a lot of our food, I would imagine.
Yeah, we do.
But I guess we also export quite a lot of food to different countries. I mean, is there a chance that all those kinds of import-export transitions are going to be severely impacted, or is it not?
Well, potentially so, yes. I mean, it seems to have held up quite well so far. I mean, ironically, I think Brexit is probably more of an issue than the crisis for some of our exports. Particularly, I mean, it depends what trade arrangements we come up with. But I mean, we do have an issue. We export quite a lot of sheep to France and elsewhere, and that could be knocked for six if we don't get this kind of trade deal. We have a straight. I mean, our food. It's odd in a way that we export any food, because obviously we're a net importer. We export a combination of things. I mean, some are like sheep, where we're good sheep country, but we don't eat a vast amount of sheep meat, and there is quite a demand on Europe. That's one thing. The other things are just very high value. So it might be high value cheese. We import high value cheese. We export high value cheese because different consumers have different likes there. Scotch whiskey is a big export for us. Very, very high value. Obviously unique to, well, pretty well unique. Americans pretend they produce something, but to this country. So, and that, I guess, will carry on. It's hardly an essential commodity. Well, it might be for some people, but it's. I think the big sector that I'm looking at and I'm really interested in is horticulture. We are a big net importer of fresh fruit and veg. We have a capacity in this country to produce a lot more. It may well be that the current crisis actually helps us move towards producing more. It's early days to say, but I would like to see our horticulture boosted, whether through this or through anything else. I mean, I think it makes sense. That's it's a commodity that the quickest it can get from field or glasshouse to your plate and my plate, the better. In terms of its nutritional quality, fresh is what matters, and we import an awful lot of this at the moment, and we could produce more ourselves. There are some interesting issues around doing that, and labour, of course, is one of them. Back to one of your earlier points.
Yeah, I mean, do you think there's a chance that the crisis? I mean, you've also mentioned Brexit, but do you think there's a chance that this could change our eating habits, our food purchasing habits?
Yeah, well, that's another interesting issue, isn't it? We've been talking mostly about production, but consumption is clearly dramatically changed. You don't, if you don't get rid of restaurants, cafes, and etc., and not see change. People are obviously cooking more at home. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of that, and there's, social media, swappings of recipes, and all that sort of stuff. I think people will have been learning or relearning or remembering some of those old skills, and I think that's all for the good. I suspect families have been eating together more than they would have done before the crisis. So there may be quite a few positive aspects of the sort of change in food culture that comes about this. There's been a big increase in people trying to grow their own as well. I was desperately worried whether I was going to get any seeds I wanted to buy online, because the company I buy from and have done for some time was saying that they were absolutely inundated with orders for seeds. So I think, yeah, I think we might see some sort of lasting change in that. I mean, I'm thinking as people begin to return to work, if they might not be able to eat out, or if it's only going to be takeaways and there's social distancing, it's probably going to be a logistical nightmare. So it could well be the old-fashioned packed lunch, might make something of a return. Yeah. So I think, I think our food culture is likely to change. I mean, I still weigh up in my own mind, I'm sure we all do, is when an end comes, if an end comes, and I guess that's when a vaccine is developed, etc., and it might be a year, it might, is there going to be a rush back to the normal, and people are going to heave a sigh of relief and say we can be just as we were before, or are people actually saying, hey, we learned a lot through this, and we're going to sort of carry on with some of those changes? So that might be modes of getting to work, it might be working from home, and it might well be how we eat.
And obviously you're starting a research project looking at the impact of COVID on the food supply chain. How do you think we're coping in the UK in terms of like food supply, food production, compared to other countries? Have you got any insight into that?
I haven't got much insight into other countries, I'll be honest with you. I've been trying to follow just this country, and that's hard enough. I wouldn't imagine there's a huge difference, because basically we're talking about a global food system, and we're talking about global food supply chains, and the logistics and the operational aspects are quite similar from one country to the next. We do have in this country, we're characteristic by probably one of the highest dependencies on the supermarkets in the Western world, but most of them are pretty high these days. We have one of the highest eatings of processed food in the Western world. I think probably we are the highest. We have a lot of fast food outlets. So we tend to be at the head of that particular trend.
Okay.
And so those sides will be affected slightly more here than maybe in some countries. Yeah. But what we're going to be looking at in our research is how a number of the key food sectors, we're looking at flour, fish, fresh fruit and veg, dairy and meat, what the supply challenges have been, what the changes to route to market have been for producers and manufacturers and distributors, where there have been problems, and if there have been, how they've been overcome, and what the lessons of that are going forward. So that's kind of, we're taking a sort of food systems approach. Everything is, there is a system for each commodity, and some of them are very long and with lots of players, some of them are much shorter. Some of it involves manufacturing of food, and some of it is just pick a carrot in the field, put it in a bag and sell it to a consumer, and might eat it raw. But other things is very complex manufacturing and processing. So we're going to try and look at that. We're very dependent on the industry, various industries, to help us in this, because in a sense it's not something you can go and read about. I mean, because this stuff's happening all the time. So our plan is to have a panel of quite a large panel of experts who we convene every 2 or 3 weeks, but it'll be different flavour each time. So it might be the flavour of fish one week and the flavour of dairy, and so we expect different members of the panel to come in to look at what's happening in the supply chain, particularly trying to pick up on 2 particular issues where the supply chain is deeply affected, maybe to the detriment of actual producers and manufacturers of food, or where consumers are affected. So those are the 2 sort of things that we're particularly interested in terms of making sure that resilience comes out of this. So what sector we've not yet mentioned is fish. I don't really know much about fish and fishing. It's not been an area I've ever investigated before, but we put this in because it's a sector that has been really dramatically affected because of the loss of restaurant trade and the loss of some of the export markets. And so some fishermen are just not going out to sea for that reason. That has caused supply issues for the more conventional fish that we do eat. Fish, okay, I respect some people are vegans and wouldn't touch it, but it's actually nutritiously an important part of many people's diets. And I mean, there's a lot to be said for fish in diet from a nutritional point of view. So it's quite, from my point of view, it's quite important to look at that one quite closely, and also to try and learn some of the lessons from that as to how we've been eating fish. I mean, it's quite intriguing, isn't it, that if restaurant trade declines, we eat less fish. Well, we probably shouldn't be eating less fish because it's rather good for us.
Yeah.
So why is it that some things, actually, funny enough, we talked about lamb earlier. Lamb's another one. Lamb is eaten more in restaurants than at home. Those sort of interesting little cultural things. Why is that the case? You know, why are we more likely to eat lamb and fish when we go to a restaurant than we are in our own home? And it's all sorts of intriguing little questions like that. But it is the restaurant trade that is often the one that's been really affected by some of this.
Excellent. Now, just one final question. You mentioned resilience there. Ultimately wanting to build resilience in the supply chain through this research. Also, earlier on, we mentioned Brexit. Due to happen at the end of the year. I mean, how well set up do you think UK agriculture is? Looking ahead to another challenge on top of the one already.
I mean, I don't think it is as well set up as it should be. And there is a major issue here, which is as follows, that basically during this year of transition, we were supposed to be trialling new environment land management schemes with a move towards those coming in. And we were also supposed to be helping businesses to adapt, to think about less dependence on basic payments from the Common Agricultural Policy once we leave, and a gradual phasing of those out. Now, those things have not been happening in the way that were expected. Farmers cannot meet together at the moment in discussion groups to think about the new policies. I've been closely involved with the Princess Countryside Fund over the last few years, and their resilience programme. I spoke to one of the last speaking engagements I had before the lockdown was speaking to a resilience group in West Devon. They're no longer meeting, and these are farmers that were coming together. Farmers sometimes with slightly fragile businesses, learning from each other, learning from outside speakers, learning from a couple of experienced facilitators, and really trying to plan ahead for what their business might look like in a post-Brexit world. And a lot of that stuff's not happening.
Yeah.
And I feel the government should not postpone Brexit. I mean, that's a bigger question. That's not for me. But I certainly think they should slow down the policy change. So, not begin phasing basic payment out straight away. Just slow things down to give the agricultural industry the opportunity to adjust. It's the biggest change in agricultural policy since 1940, and to have that alongside the COVID crisis and not to slow the pace of change is, I think, very misguided. I know that there has been pressure on government to slow things down. As far as I know, I mean, I'm not in the inner circle, obviously, as far as I know, that pressure has been resisted so far. And that, I think, is very unfortunate.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that, Michael. Some really interesting points there. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to us today, and we'll be back with a few more videos very soon.
Great.